The different forms of trauma. Presented by the Ward and Wellness Services. In association with C.J. Ward Creations. Complex trauma. Complex trauma refers to a child's exposure to a number of traumatic events, most of which are invasive and interpersonal in character, as well as the wide-ranging, long-term consequences of such exposure. Abuse or severe neglect are examples of severe and widespread events. They frequently happen early in life and can interfere with many elements of a child's development and sense of self. Because these occurrences frequently involve a caregiver, they obstruct the child's capacity to build a stable relationship. This fundamental source of safety and stability is critical to a child's healthy physical and mental development. Effects: children whose families and homes do not consistently offer them with safety, comfort, and protection may develop coping mechanisms that allow them to survive and function on a daily basis. For example, they may be too sensitive to other people's moods, constantly looking to see how the adults around them are feeling and reacting. They may hide their own emotions from others, never revealing when they are scared, sad, or furious. When physical and/or mental threats are always present, these types of learned adaptations make sense. These adaptations are no longer beneficial as a child grows up and experiences safe conditions and relationships. In fact, they may be counterproductive and interfere with the capacity to live, love, and be loved. Children can be affected by complex trauma in a variety of ways. Here are some of the most typical side effects. Attachment and relationships. It is impossible to exaggerate the importance of a child's tight contact with a caregiver. Children learn to trust others, manage their emotions, and engage with the environment through interactions with important attachment figures. They develop a sense of the world as safe or unsafe, and they start to appreciate their own value as individuals. Children learn that they cannot rely on others to aid them when those interactions are unstable or unpredictable. When a child's primary caretakers abuse and exploit him or her, the child learns that he or she is bad and that the world is a dreadful place. The majority of abused or neglected children struggle to form a strong, healthy bond with a caregiver. Stress has been demonstrated to be more vulnerable in children who do not have good bonds. They struggle to manage and express their emotions, and they may respond violently or inappropriately in some situations. Our ability to form healthy, supportive connections with friends and significant others is contingent on our ability to form such relationships in our families. A child with a complicated trauma background may struggle in sexual relationships, friendships, and with authoritative figures like teachers or cops. Physical health, body and brain. The biology of the body evolves from birth until adolescence. The environment influences biological function in some ways. The immune system and the body's stress response systems may not develop normally if a child grows up fearful or under constant or acute stress. When the child or adult is later subjected to even moderate amounts of stress, these systems may react as though the person is under acute stress. When confronted with stressful events, an individual may exhibit strong physiological reaction, such as fast breathing or heart pounding, or may shut down completely. While these responses are adaptive when confronted with a serious threat, they are out of proportion in the context of typical stress, and are sometimes misunderstood by others as overreacting, unresponsive, or distant. The development of the brain and nervous system can be hampered by stress in the environment. In neglectful situations, a lack of mental stimulation may prevent the brain from reaching its full potential. Chronic or recurrent physical symptoms, such as headaches or stomachaches, may develop in children with complicated trauma histories. Adults who experience childhood trauma have been demonstrated to have more chronic bodily diseases and issues. They may engage in unsafe actions that exacerbate the problems, example, smoking, substance use, and diet and exercise habits that lead to obesity. Body dysregulation is common in complexly traumatized kids, which means they overreact or underreact to sensory stimuli. They could be hypersensitive to sounds, scents, touch, or light, or they could be suffering from anesthesia and analgesia, in which case they are oblivious to pain, touch, or internal bodily sensations. As a result, individuals may harm themselves without realizing it, suffer from bodily difficulties without realizing it, or, on the other hand, complain of persistent discomfort in numerous body parts with no physical cause. Emotional responses. Children who have been through significant trauma may have trouble identifying, expressing, and managing emotions, as well as limited vocabulary for expressing and managing feelings. They frequently internalize and/or externalize stress reactions, which can lead to major melancholy, anxiety, or aggression. Their emotional reactions could be erratic or explosive. When a youngster is reminded of a traumatic occurrence, they may react with trembling, rage, sadness, or avoidance. Reminders of multiple traumatic incidents may be found everywhere in the surroundings for a youngster with a complicated trauma history. When a youngster is unhappy, he or she may react frequently, strongly, and have difficulties calming down. Because interpersonal traumas are so common, even minimally unpleasant contacts with others can function as trauma memories and elicit strong emotional responses. Children are typically alert and guarded in their dealings with others, and are more prone to see circumstances as stressful or hazardous, having learnt that the world is a terrible place where even loved ones can't be trusted to protect you. While this defensive stance is beneficial when an individual is being attacked, it can be harmful in times where such strong reflexes are not required. Many youngsters, on the other hand, learn to tune out emotional numbing to hazards in their surroundings, leaving them exposed to re-victimization. Emotional difficulties are common, and they can develop even when there are no relationships. Many of these children are quickly overwhelmed because they have never learned how to calm themselves down when they are upset. For example, they may feel so frustrated at school that they abandon even simple activities that are difficult. Children who have been exposed to early and severe traumatic events are more likely to feel scared all of the time and in a variety of scenarios. They are also more likely to suffer from depression. Dissociation. Dissociation is common in children who have experienced complex trauma. When children are confronted with a frightening or overpowering experience, they may dissociate, or psychologically remove themselves from it. They may believe they are separate from their bodies, floating on the ceiling or elsewhere in the room, viewing what is going on with their bodies. They might feel as if they're in a dream or in some other altered condition, or as if the encounter is occurring to someone else. Alternatively, individuals may lose all recollections or understanding of what has happened to them, resulting in temporal gaps or even holes in their personal history. A youngster may cut off or lose contact with many aspects of the self at its most severe. Although children cannot disassociate unintentionally, once they have learned to do so as a defensive mechanism, they may dissociate automatically in other stressful situations or when confronted with trauma memories. Dissociation can make it difficult for a youngster to be fully present in everyday activities and can cause a child's sense of time and continuity to be shattered. As a result, learning, classroom behavior, and social interactions may suffer as a result. Others may not notice that a child is dissociating, and it may look that the child is merely pinging out, daydreaming, or not paying attention at times. Behavior. A child who has had multiple traumas may be readily triggered or set off, and is more prone to react violently. The youngster may have trouble with self-control, i.e., knowing how to cool down, as well as impulse control and the ability to consider consequences before acting. As a result, children who have been through a lot of trauma may act in unpredictable, oppositional, volatile, and severe ways. A youngster who feels powerless, or who has grown up fearful of an abusive authority figure may behave defensively and angrily in response to perceived criticism or attack. Or, on the other hand, may be over-controlled, inflexible, and unusually cooperative with adults. If a youngster dissociates frequently, it will have an impact on his or her behavior. A child like this may appear spacey, aloof, remote, or disconnected from reality. Children who have been through a lot of trauma are more prone to participate in high-risk behaviors like self-harm, hazardous sexual practices, and taking unnecessary risks like driving at high speeds. They may also engage in unlawful behaviors such as drinking and using drugs, assaulting others, stealing, fleeing, and/or prostitution, increasing their chances of being involved with the juvenile justice system. Cognition, thinking and learning. Children with complicated trauma histories may struggle to think properly, reason, or solve problems. They may be unable to plan ahead, foresee the future, and take appropriate action. When children grow up in a perpetual state of peril, they devote all of their internal resources to surviving. When their bodies and minds have become accustomed to being in chronic stress response mode, individuals may find it difficult to think through a problem calmly and explore different options. They may struggle to learn new skills or absorb new knowledge. They may have trouble maintaining focus or curiosity, or they may be distracted by emotional responses to trauma reminders. They could have problems with language development and abstract reasoning. Many children who have been through profound trauma have learning challenges that may necessitate extra help in the classroom. Self-concept and future orientation, the emotions of others, particularly those closest to them, teach children about their own worth. The largest influence on a child's sense of self-worth and value is caregivers. Abuse and neglect make a child feel insignificant and hopeless. When a youngster is abused, he or she frequently blames himself or herself. It may seem safer to blame oneself rather than admitting that the parent is untrustworthy and dangerous. Shame, remorse, low self-esteem, and a negative self-image are typical among children who have experienced complicated trauma. A youngster must value himself or herself in order to plan for the future with hope and purpose. Planning for the future necessitates optimism, control, and the ability to regard one's own actions as meaningful and valuable. Children who grow up in violent homes and communities learn early on that they can't trust anyone, that the world is dangerous, and that they have little power to change their circumstances. Their sense of competence is harmed by their beliefs about themselves, others, and the world. Their negative expectations obstruct positive problem solving and prevent them from making a positive influence in their own lives. A traumatized youngster may consider himself as impotent and damaged, and the world as a meaningless place where planning and positive action are fruitless. They have a hard time believing in themselves. The youngster, having learned to operate in survival mode, lives in the now without pausing to consider, plan for, or even fantasize about the future. Long-term health consequences. Childhood trauma has been related to an increase in medical issues throughout an individual's life. The Adverse Childhood Experiences (ACE) study is a long-term research project that looks into the long-term effects of childhood trauma on adults. Over 17,000 people, ranging in age from 19 to 90, have taken part in the ACE study. Researchers obtained medical histories over time, as well as information on the participants' early experiences with abuse, aggression, and caregivers who were handicapped. According to the findings, approximately 64% of participants had at least one encounter to childhood trauma, with 69% reporting 2 or more occurrences. The findings revealed a link between childhood trauma exposure, high-risk behaviors, such as smoking and unprotected sex, chronic illnesses like heart disease and cancer, and early death. Economic impact. The cumulative economic and societal cost of early complex trauma is enormous. A realistic estimate of the yearly cost of child abuse and neglect is $103.8 billion, or $284.3 million per day, based on data from a variety of sources, in 2007 values. This figure includes both direct costs, approximately $70.7 billion, for immediate needs of maltreated children, hospitalization, mental health care, child welfare systems, and law enforcement, and indirect costs, approximately $33.1 billion, for the secondary or long-term effects of child abuse and neglect, special education, juvenile delinquency, mental health and health care, adult criminal justice system, and lost productivity to society. According to a recent research of documented incidents of child maltreatment in the United States, the overall lifetime costs of child maltreatment are estimated to be $124 billion during a 12-month period. The estimated cost per case of child maltreatment in the 1,740 fatal cases was $1.3 million, including medical bills and lost productivity. The estimated average lifetime cost per victim of child maltreatment for the 579,000 non-fatal instances was $210,012. Which includes costs for health care throughout one's life, productivity losses, child welfare, criminal justice, and special education. The costs of these non-fatal occurrences of child maltreatment are comparable to other high-cost health disorders, for example, stroke victims pay $159,846 and type 2 diabetes patients pay $181,000 to $253,000. In addition to these expenditures, victims and their families suffer intangible losses such as anguish, sadness, and a lower quality of life. The most substantial expense of child maltreatment may be such unquantifiable losses. Screening and assessment. Clinical illustration. Celia is a 12-year-old girl with a long history of trauma. Child Protective Services first removed her from her mother's home at the age of 3 for neglect and parental substance abuse. After 10 months, she was reunited with her mother, who married her live-in boyfriend soon afterwards. Celia remained in their care from ages 4 through 7, and then was removed again when she disclosed that she'd been sexually abused by her stepfather and had witnessed domestic violence between her mother and stepfather. Following this second placement in foster care, Celia was referred for an assessment due to academic problems, severe inattention, hyperactivity, and oppositional behavior, as well as physically violent tantrums. She was diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder and bipolar disorder. Treatments addressing her behavior, including medication and therapy, have been minimally successful. Following her adoption at age 9, her unpredictable mood swings, non-compliance, and a more persistent preoccupation with sexual ideas continued to be a concern. Celia's symptoms are frequent among children who have been exposed to several traumas from an early age and who are in caregiver relationships where they should feel protected. These children frequently exhibit a wide range of developmental impairments, including difficulty developing and maintaining relationships, behavioral issues, emotional problems, dissociation, learning disabilities, and even chronic health problems, in addition to typical post-traumatic stress reactions. Multiple diagnoses and probable misdiagnoses are common as a result of their intricate symptom presentation, especially when the impact of their complex trauma histories remains unnoticed. As a result, clinicians must conduct a complete assessment that covers this wide spectrum of reactions. A thorough evaluation must also carefully record and track the numerous traumatic incidents in order to link them to developmental stumbling blocks. How to conduct a comprehensive assessment of complex trauma. Complex trauma evaluation is by definition complex, since it requires evaluating both children's exposure to several traumatic experiences and the wide-ranging and severe impact of this trauma exposure across developmental domains. When seeking the most effective services for these children, it is critical that mental health providers, family members, and other caregivers become aware of certain questions to ask. The steps for doing a comprehensive assessment of complex trauma are as follows. A clinically educated physician who knows child development and complex trauma should conduct the examination. A multidisciplinary team should ideally be involved in the evaluation. A pediatrician, mental health expert, educational specialist, and, if necessary, an occupational therapist would make up an ideal team. A multidisciplinary team may also include direct care personnel familiar with the kid in residential, day treatment, and juvenile justice settings. It might be difficult to tell whether a child's symptoms are due to trauma, or if they are due to other diagnoses such as ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, or bipolar disorder after doing an examination. When employing a complex trauma framework, however, it may be more beneficial to first suspend judgment and categorization. Instead, engage in an open, flexible, and continuing procedure that tackles traumatic stress reactions early on in a child's care and throughout their treatment. It's critical to keep track of how symptoms and behaviors change over time and as a result of trauma-focused treatment. Always keep the child, family, and all caregivers in the loop on what makes sense, what works, and what the best next steps are for intervention. Resources on assessment of complex trauma. The materials listed below provide specific information and guidelines on the assessment of complex trauma for mental health professionals, other child-serving professionals, example, educators and pediatricians, and parents and caregivers. A set of standardized measures that assess a wide range of complicated trauma domains, as well as measures that focus on a specific domain in greater depth, is also available. Outcomes of trauma-informed assessment for Celia. Celia was eventually assessed by a trauma-informed clinician, which was a blessing. Her trauma history was well documented and linked to her symptom presentation. Complex trauma leaves a child distrustful of others, needing to control her environment, emotionally reactive or shut down, hyperaroused, unfocused, and distracted by fear, according to the doctor. Following the exam, the clinician convened a meeting with Celia, her adoptive parents, and her case manager to discuss her findings. Celia was able to understand the findings because they were presented in her own language. The therapist was very cautious to emphasize that Celia was not to blame for her poor habits. Instead, the doctor presented her actions as typical of youngsters who had gone through what Celia had gone through. Celia was relieved that someone else understood. Interventions. The following interventions were created with complex trauma in mind and are intended to address a variety of developmental difficulties and competencies. Some intervene with children, adolescents, or young adults on an individual basis, while others deal with children and their caregivers as a group, or with the entire family. TFCBT, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and CPP, child-parent psychotherapy, while not explicitly designed for complex trauma, have been shown to effectively reduce PTSD and related issues in a variety of complex trauma populations and contexts. For advice on how to modify TFCBT or CPP for complexly traumatized populations, please consult a professional trainer.